Hi, this is Thursday, May 11th, and we're having a conversation today with one of the leading intellectuals of Denmark, who is a very incisive and thoughtful writer about the predicament we face today in our culture, Iben Thranholm. Iben, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Even we're talking today about the crisis of a change in our society from one which was, in many ways, a Christian based or Christian influenced society into a post Christian society. Are you noticing this change and the consequences of this epochal change?
Yes, Bob, yesterday actually, I started to reflect on the fact that I was born in '69, right into the movement of, free love and, the whole cultural revolution that came in '68. So it's quite amazing that I am a Christian. I am even a convert to Catholicism, and I've always been living in a counterculture that was anti-Christian. So I was starting to think about my life in a broader perspective. That it's actually quite remarking that we still have Christians in this very anti-Christian culture where everything has been torn apart and destroyed and pulled down, and we're still here, some of us.
Hmm.
But all my life has been sort of shaped after the fact that I live in a culture, and especially here in Scandinavia, which is one of the most secular parts of the world, that I've always been, I never tried to live in a real Christian society. I've always been living in a society where Christianity was sort of, being destroyed, or people tried completely to eradicate it. And that is really something that is very fundamental in my life, that I have been in this counterculture all my life, and I started to think about what it has done to me and my identity as a Christian. That I've been living in this culture always. I never tried to live in a culture where everybody was like real Christian, like let's say 500 years ago, before the Enlightenment. So sometimes I'm wondering what it would be like to live in a true Christian culture, because what I have been raised in and what I'm living in is definitely not a Christian culture anymore.
Mhm. Well, there's several questions that come to my mind. What is the reason that you are so special, that you embraced a faith that everyone today is rejecting as something from past centuries? It's a fable, maybe something that also restricts people and their freedom and morality. Um, what attracted you? What is the story of your journey of faith?
Well, that's a good question, and that was what I was reflecting on yesterday. Of course, I was born and raised in a family where my mother and father were churchgoers. They had faith. It was a little bit unusual at that time when my mother had me when she was 38. My father was 40. At that time, that was very old, because
Mm,
all my friends had parents that were at least 10 years younger than my parents.
mm,
And my parents, they spoke openly about faith, and we prayed together, and they took me to church. And so it was very natural for them, because they were brought up in families where faith was also central. So I think, of course, that there was a huge impact from my upbringing. But of course, many other, you know, people in my generation were brought up in homes where the parents were Christians as well, but they left the church and they're not churchgoers anymore.
mm,
So
mm,
why did I embrace faith, and why did I even become a Catholic after I studied theology? Because I am a theologian. I am a master of theology, and I converted after I got my degree. And I think it was, of course, I can't help thinking about divine providence, that, God calls everybody to have intimacy with Him and to love Him. And I think for some reason I got the grace to embrace that and to listen to it. And I accepted it because I could have said no. I could have said, no, I don't want this. I don't want to embrace my higher calling as a child of God, and to have a relationship with God. But God is calling everybody. So it depends on whether we say yes or no. And for some reason, which I can't say exactly what it was, my heart decided to say yes, to
Hmm.
accept that call. And I think that's fundamental for everybody. I think that God, even in this post-Christian culture, God is doing everything he can to get the attention of people, and he's calling everybody. But the big question is, like, Our Lady, whether you said, well, let this be done according to your word to me, uh, her fiat, or if you say, no, I'm going to do it my own way.
Well, this is already to me very moving and interesting. Your description of the high calling, your description of God calling everyone to be the best and the highest they can be in relation with the ultimate reality himself. This is a way of talking and thinking of existence that's very rare today. Most people are trying to make $1 million or become prominent in their professional field. And you're speaking about relationship with the infinite, eternal, holy God who is proposing that relationship to you. I am really impressed and moved by what you've just said, but I'd still like to go a little deeper and ask, do you have some remembrance of some things that caused you to seek out or to listen to this call? Was there any special book that you read or experience that you had? Or was it in church or not in church? Was there some person who guided you or sparked your interest in addition to your parents?
Yeah, when I got my after I got my degree at university, I started to write a book about how to have faith, or in a modern society, Christian faith in a modern society. And during that time, and in my research, I came into contact with several people that were not Protestant, because at that time I was a Protestant. Of course, I'm raised in a Protestant culture, and when you study theology at the University of Copenhagen, everybody would be Protestants. Most of the students will later on become pastors in the Lutheran State Church. So I think it's more than 90% of all students at the theological faculty, they would become pastors. But at that time, I was already into journalism, and I came into contact with Catholics and also with a Greek Orthodox mystic called Vasula Rudin. Maybe you know her. I know you know her.
Yes.
And I met her in Rome, and she offered me the books where Jesus is talking to her. And I must say that it really opened a completely new world to me, because suddenly I understood what is the church, what is the Catholic Church, and this devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus was really a path for me, because this was a new way for me to discover Jesus, his Sacred Heart, which is a devotion we don't have in the Protestant Church. And that led me to dig deeper into the Catholic Church, also the Orthodox Church, of course. But since I'm living in the western part of the world, the Catholic Church was really what I wanted to look deeper into. And I had some mystical experiences where I walked into the church and I sat down, and I had this feeling that I was not alone, even though there was nobody in the church. And
Hmm.
I would say I thought it was a little bit, maybe I was a little bit scared, because I felt there was this tremendous presence of something that was so much bigger than me. It was very peaceful, but I was not used to this kind of feeling of something that was so strong, this very strong presence. And of course, later on, because I'm a theologian, I realized it was, of course, because of the tabernacle, that Jesus is present within the Eucharist, and he's always dwelling in the tabernacle. And some years prior to that journey I set out on, after I met Vasula, I had an experience when I was a theological student where I was invited into a Catholic church. And I was extremely moved, and I started to cry, and I was together with other people, and I didn't want them to see me crying. And I felt, and I'm pretty sure right now that this was a kind of precursor. It was a kind of meeting I had with Jesus. But at that time, I had no understanding of what was going on in this particular room, which is the Catholic Church. But I was very moved. And then later on, some years after, I got the same experience. And then I started to understand the theology behind it. And I must say that it was this mystical presence, because whenever I went back to a Protestant church, because in the beginning I thought, okay, maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe I should go back and see if I can sort of induce the same experience in a Protestant church. But the room was really empty. There was like nobody at home. And when I went back to the Catholic church, it just has this extreme, wonderful feeling of this presence. And that really convinced me that Jesus is present in the Catholic Church, and it is authentic, that the Eucharist is really his body and his blood. And when you get that kind of truth and you understand that this is the truth, I mean, I could not go back. I couldn't go back and say, okay, I saw that, I acknowledged that, but now I'm going back to the Protestant church. You just can't do that
Hmm.
if you had this kind of encounter with Christ, which is
Well, I must.
which is
Mhm.
powerful and so strong. And that was why, quite quickly I decided to become a Catholic, even though it was a kind of risky affair, because in Denmark there is a lot of anti-Catholic propaganda, I would say. And I know, because I am a theologian, and I had been listening to all my professors during my studies, and they were all very much against the Catholic faith, almost ridiculing it. So I knew that it would probably be there would be a tough time ahead of me. But I decided anyway to do this, because, like I said before, I got the grace to accept this calling. So I did it no matter what. But it turned out to be a huge blessing, and I never really lacked any kind of work, even though I
Hmm.
became Catholic, because, of course, being a theologian, I could not anymore become a pastor in the Lutheran Church, being a Catholic, of course. And in the Catholic Church, I couldn't become a priest because I'm a woman. So my studies, I was a little bit afraid that they would be of no use. And then, I started journalism. I was already into journalism, and a new door started to open. So I never regretted it that I became a Catholic. Never.
Well, once again, I'm astonished and moved by your description of mystical experiences of closeness with the great mystery. The historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, speaks about the Mysterium Tremendes and says uh, the encounter with the transcendent changes a person. It appears it's in keeping with what you said, that God is reaching out in all places and all times to people to raise them up and to come into a higher relationship with Him. But you then found that it was in the Catholic Church, precisely the church which has come under such criticism now, as in the past, for being a kind of encrusted structure that is a structure of domination, of power, and not a kind of living space where one can encounter Jesus Christ or the Holy Spirit. You seem to have found a church that many people don't seem to find anymore. You find in the Catholic Church a source of meaning, a source of warmth, a personal relationship. I'm astonished by this story. Are you? Can you react to what I just said?
Yeah, but I think many people, they start to focus too much on the political aspect. But because I was raised as a Protestant, I have heard all these accusations against the Catholic Church for many, many years, that it was only about power, it was hypocrites, all these terrible things. So I was used to that. So when I suddenly saw the church from a completely different perspective, because I had this personal mystical experience, I started to understand that this was just lies and it was not true. And of course, being a theologian, I started to study Catholic theology, and I would say it was much more coherent than Protestant theology. So it was by all means, it was like entering some kind of treasury. So I think everybody could have the same experience as I had or have continuously, but it depends on how open you are. I
Mm,
think it takes some kind of, I wouldn't say that I'm a humble person. It's something that I really struggle with, to be humble, but but you need to be somehow humble, and you need to understand that when that man is involved in an institution, there will always be corruption.
mhm,
And it actually started from the very first day, because the first moral corruption was within the circle of the disciples. It was one of Jesus's own disciples that betrayed him.
mhm,
So we have this kind of scenario going on again and again and again. It is the people within the inner circle that is betraying Christ, and we see that today as well. So nothing has changed. So for me, that's not a reason not to be part of the church. It's just what it has always been like. So we need to deal with that. And Christ accepted. Even Peter denied him 3 times.
mhm,
So he actually knew that we were going to let him down and betray him. Despite that, the Catholic Church still exists, and that is actually the proof that the church is, or that Christ is the head of the church, is that it still exists, even though so many people have tried to destroy it through all ages. So for me, that is actually just a proof that it is, the true Church of Christ.
Okay, that again raises the question. Right now in 2023, the church is still very much in a period of a type of a crisis. Its priesthood seems to be under attack. The life of religious women and nuns seems to be in crisis in a certain way. Many of the orders have only old members and very few young people, but there are signs in some places of renewal. And what you've really given us is a kind of testimony to the eternal beauty of the church, no matter what the circumstances. Beauty ever ancient, ever new. And it's very moving to talk with you about your experience as a person from Denmark in a very secularizing world. And I wondered if we could go back to your studies. I believe you studied Soren Kierkegaard, the existentialist Protestant philosopher who was regarded as the first existentialist who has been followed by many others in the 19th and 20th centuries who tried to go in a personal way amid sort of restrictive church structures to find faith, to find a personal encounter with God, to find Christ. But you have your questions and some even criticisms of Kierkegaard's thought. Is that
Yeah,
true?
I was very much into the studies of Søren Kierkegaard when I was studying theology at the University of Copenhagen. We had a Søren Kierkegaard Research Center, and I worked as an assistant to the professor that was in charge of the whole library. So we had a lot of students coming from all over the world, and especially many Americans as well. There is a St. Kierkegaard library in Minnesota at St. Olaf's College.
Uh,
Yeah, and I was also visiting this library. So there were a lot of people coming from all around the world to study St. Kierkegaard. And that was, of course, a very stimulating and interesting environment. We had a lot of discussions about Søren Kierkegaard and his thinkings, and I wrote my master dissertation on Søren Kierkegaard and the way he understood his life. Like actually, that he thought that the whole thing was set up by divine providence. Even though he is an existentialist, he believed that his whole life was orchestrated by divine providence, and he was just like a chosen one to do what he did, writing all these books. So that was quite interesting to see how he had, I wouldn't say he was a fatalist, but he had a really very strong belief that his whole life was sort of guided and was arranged by divine providence. And I thought that was interesting because at that time when I was studying, there were a lot of liberals and progressives that thought that you could read Kierkegaard from a deconstructive literature approach, and um, and that was very secular. It was a very, like Kierkegaard never really understood himself what actually he was writing, all sorts of nonsense, in my opinion. And I was very interested in Søren Kierkegaard from a more theological perspective.
Hmm.
But after I became a Catholic, I actually I have distanced myself a little bit from him because I think that he has some serious problems in his theology, at least by the end of his authorship. That is very problematic because he actually rejected the idea of church and sacrament. And being a Catholic, of course, the church as an institution and the sacrament is the center. And Kierkegaard, even when he was on his deathbed, he would not even receive a priest. He didn't want to receive communion because it would only be a priest that could offer him communion. He didn't want that. And I think that was quite problematic for him. And I peace be on his soul. I hope that he has his eternal reward. But he really ended up in a very, I think he painted himself up into a corner in the end, and that was not good. And Kierkegaard should have met the Catholic mysticism. I think he would have developed completely differently, and I think his writings and his authorship would have been completely different if he had some kind of mystical approach or meeting. But if you go through all his diaries and his writings, there's really nothing about Catholicism. There's nothing about mysticism. He had no relationship with that. He's a very intellectual Protestant thinker, and it's not a coincidence that he one of his first major works is Either Or. This is a very Protestant thinking, either or. You have this kind of division or separation of the world, whereas Catholic theology is both and. So it means that
Ah,
you can combine things, but in the Protestant thinking, you have to to make a lot of what is it called, to divide your understanding of the world. For instance, many Protestants, they cannot make science and faith come together. That's a typical Protestant problem. But if you're Catholic, it's really not a problem to
hmm.
combine those things. And Kierkegaard was very much into this thinking of either or. And I think, for instance, he also called the leap of faith, he actually calls it absurd, that faith is a kind of absurd act. It's one of his major works called Fear and Trembling, where he writes about how Abraham could sacrifice Isaac. And he talks about that this kind of faith is absurd. But as a Catholic, I would say that faith is a mystery. It's not, absurd. So he is a modern thinker, even though he is also a very traditional Christian. Like, he believed that his life was totally arranged by divine providence. He's also a modern thinker that is introducing what has led to the de-Christianization of our culture. So he's very ambiguous personality in many ways.
Well, thank you very much for that quick summary of your appreciation and concern about Kierkegaard. I do think this search for God, which is really what we are talking about, a society that ends up without faith, without God, seems to be the society that we are creating today. A society that has no absolute moral principles, everything is relative. And this society seems to be emerging really for 200 years from the French Revolution and men like Soren Kierkegaard as they started to try to find faith because the structures of Christian transmission of the Christian faith through the churches, the Catholic and Protestant churches, somehow became sclerotic or blocked in some way for many people. And nevertheless, there was a great flourishing still in Catholicism in the late 1800s, often with Marian piety and Bernadette of Lourdes, and then later in the early 20th century, the Children of Fatima. And this, uh, with many amazing figures who did transmit the faith, including John Henry Newman in England, and then Pius X, and the popes in general continued to do a good job to try to hold fast to the teaching of the faith. And then the 20th century really exploded with communism, fascism, Nazism, consumerism, liberalism, all sort of things that in the end were disconnected from or directly opposed to this Christian faith, which brought about a relationship with a eternal God. And Kierkegaard represented the beginning of that phase as he's seeking that. And as you say, he was halfway, one foot still in the Christian world, believing in divine providence, but the other foot in the swirling currents, really, of modernity, where he's seeking. So that brings us, and perhaps in too simplistic a way, though, it brings us to our present time, where we're now in the early 21st century. Many of the external markers of the Christian faith have been in decline. Some are in dramatic decline. I mentioned a few minutes ago the religious orders and vocations, and the number of priests being ordained is in some places almost becoming non-existent. There's a one or two when there used to be 1 or 200. So something has happened in modernity which has led to a secular humanism embraced, a view that there's only the secular and only the human, that there's not the sacred and not the divine. This seems to be the generally accepted worldview today. So I see it as transitioning from a Christian worldview where it was still possible to become a mystic, and you being an example of someone who still drew from that tradition, to a secular humanist post-Christian worldview, which is now dominant today and increasingly trying new frontiers, let's say, continuing to be almost a continuing revolution.
Mhm.
Does this seem to be a reasonable interpretation of our situation?
Yeah, and I want to go back to Søren Kierkegaard, because one thing he really introduced and stressed was the concept of the single individual. He's very concerned about that. He's addressing many of his writings where he talks to the single individual or the solitary individual, because he believes that, of course, God is it's God saves, of course, a single individual. And he was very opposed to any democratic idea that he said that the crowd is untruth. So he wanted to stress the single individual. And in this context, of course, he was right. In front of God, you are the single individual. You cannot say, "Oh, but it was all the others." Of course, we are still a community. We believe, as Christians, we believe that we are in the community of saints. We believe that we are in the body of Christ. We're all members of the body of Christ. And Kierkegaard moves away from that kind of concept of that concept. So I think, even though he wants to believe that this is a Christian category, it turns out that what is really the biggest problem for many people today to approach faith life and to open up their soul to something that is bigger than them is this absolute, I would almost say, individualism. that the
Hmm.
single individual has become absolute. Of course, Kierkegaard would say, well, only God is representing what is absolute. But today you see that the single individual is actually the center of the world. It's me
Hmm.
who has become God, and it's only me. Is kind of self-worship. And I think that Kierkegaard somehow paves the way for that by focusing completely on the single individual. And in the end, he says there is only the single individual that can be Christian. We cannot talk about Christian countries. He's very, very upset about the Danish church. He's very disappointed with the church. So in the end, he thinks it's only the single individual that can be a Christian completely on his own. He's not in any kind of community. He's not in the church. He's just trying to live up to the ethics of Jesus Christ. And
Hmm.
everybody who actually tried to live as a Christian, like Kierkegaard suggests, has failed because you're simply too alone. And I think he could not have foreseen this kind of development into secularism, where now it is the single individual that has become sort of divinized, that it's only me and my perception of reality, my feelings, whatever I think, that counts. And I think this is the greatest barrier for people to have a relationship with God, is this idea that they have become gods themselves. And this is probably the
Hmm.
whole aspect of what is modern, is that it is the single individual, which is something that Kierkegaard was really stressing the importance of, that has become the center of the universe.
Okay. So what you have said is of critical importance, and it's very illuminating. The soul of the individual person needs to be saved. Jesus Christ, as he goes through Palestine and he meets one person and another and the centurion, and he always is present to that one person, and each of us has our personal journey. But somehow this exasperated individualism that leaves behind completely the concept of a people, a family, a church, a community, where the individual plays a part, is not the sole protagonist, is the key sort of illness or disease psychologically and philosophically of our age. It's an exaggerated individualism. It's a narcissism. We,
Yeah, and actually, I think it is more than that. I think it is the cardinal sin, which is pride. That we think that we are better than God and we know better than God. We don't need God's wisdom. We don't need his grace. We don't need anybody. We are just doing it our own way. And this is pride. And this is
yeah.
the cardinal sin. And I think the whole society is completely absorbed into this mortal sin. And that's why for many people it becomes so difficult to go into the church and try to have this mystical encounter, because there are, I mean, of course, if you live in a culture where everybody thinks that pride is normal and pride is what you should, I mean, should be the fundament of your lifestyle, or the essence of your lifestyle. Today, all the cardinal sins are just completely normal. I
Hmm.
mean, vanity, that's completely normal. Lust is completely normal. Greed, gluttony, everything is completely normal. Nobody thinks there's anything wrong with that.
Hmm.
So it has become completely normal to live in mortal sin. And you know that if your soul is in mortal sin, it doesn't mean you're going to die tomorrow, but it means that your soul is completely detached from God, and you need to clean that kind of dirt out of your heart or your soul before you can approach God. So
Well,
you are so you are spiritually disconnected. It doesn't mean that God does not want to have anything to do with you, or he's not trying to reach out, but maybe you're blocked and you can't.
yeah. And what you told me on another occasion, that in the northern countries, the Nordic countries, there's even a reemergence of paganism,
Hmm.
uh, because the human really doesn't completely, is never satisfied without having some sort of a god. And the Nordic countries, you say, are completely secularized now, but they're not satisfied with modern secularism. They're seeking something more because that drive in human beings for the infinite, for the eternal, still moves us towards these things. Can you discuss this just for a moment?
Yeah, I mean there are two aspects here, because one is, of course, that the soul is always longing for more than just what the secular society can give. But I think there is also a worship of something demonic. And I think many of the spiritualities that are reviving, that's not new age, it's actually old age, because it's old pagan rituals, which could be somehow influenced by the demonic world, that is now being revived.
Hmm.
So it means that, of course, if Christians are getting weaker and weaker, and nobody prays, there is no faith, of course, evil has a much better opportunity to spread. And also the spirituality of evil. And for instance, here in Denmark, everybody knows that Danes are Vikings. That's kind of, kind of tourist brand that we're Vikings. But actually, more and more people here are getting interested in this Norse religion, pagan religion, and where they're doing some kind of rituals, which is kind of sacrifice you do out in the woods at night, which they used to do, and it's being revived more and more. And I think part of it is because many people today are attracted to the Viking culture because you have like this very strong masculinity and strong, values with strong people. And I think in Denmark, Christianity in the state church, which is a Protestant state church, has become very feminine. So, for instance, there are a lot of young men who think that going back to the Viking rituals are somehow something that can empower them, I think, and they are also attracted to the mystical element of it in a way,
We have
which
we have a comment here. Edward
is not.
W. Right. Can you see the comment on the screen, Iben?
Scandinavian countries were the leaders in spreading and accepting sexual immorality in the world. Who said that? Oh,
Well, this is one of
is it
our listeners.
okay? Yeah, okay, yeah. Yes, yes, because we were the first country to legalize pornography in 69 or 70, I think. So yeah, we were the first country to open up to pornography, and also one of the first countries to legalize abortion. So yeah, we have some heavy sins on our on our shoulders, and
Well, well,
that's not good.
um, let's see. We wanted to. We're coming up on getting towards the end of our hour. We still have some time. How do you see this unfolding now? This longing of people for God, and even expressing this in a search for the old pagan gods as the demons come in, and this society that's claiming that it's reached the pinnacle of human scientific knowledge and human reason, but seemingly becoming ever more irrational. In my opinion, it's the loss that we had in Jesus Christ and in the Logos of God, the Logos, the reason of God, the Word of God, that provided us with a kind of standard for fighting against the seven cardinal sins, fighting against it, pride and bringing humility. But this entire way of seeing reality is being overthrown, and it's claiming that it's reasonable and it's the best way. But don't you think our society has got many signs that it's not the best way?
Well, it's actually the first time in the history of man that we have a completely atheistic society. It never happened before in our entire history as human beings, because even before Christianity, you had, pagan gods like we just talked about. And they had some kind of idea of course, that there was something that was divine, something that was sacred, something they needed to respect, some kind of limits they could not transgress.
Hmm.
Whether it was the sun or it was the nature or it was some kind of pagan god, there were limits to human activity and what humans being could do. This is completely gone. Now, like I said before, we are the center of the world. And that's a completely new situation in our world history, that we have this completely rejection of anything metaphysical, anything transcendent.
Well, we
And so I don't know where this is going to take us, but I mean, St. Paul writes in the second letter to the Corinthians about the great apostasy, the age of the great apostasy. He talks about that.
mm,
And I think this is probably where we are now, the great apostasy. So it's not just like, oh, we gone wrong and we lost the Christian faith. This is a very serious crisis in the history of mankind, because we are in this total rejection of God, like never before. And I
well,
think God must be extremely patient, because he's really being so offended every day. I heard an exorcist, Father Chad Ripperger. He said that there are like seven billion people on earth. Let's say that just everybody commits one sin per day. It's like 7 billion sins offending God every day. And we have a whole culture now that has turned against God. So I don't know where this is gonna end, but I'm sure that it somehow, we need some kind of divine intervention to turn it around. I'm not sure
well,
that we can do anything ourselves, because maybe it has gone too far. I don't know.
well, I did think that there are intellectuals and very intelligent men who are proposing to go beyond God. And we have there's a man named Yuri Harari who has written a book called Homo. Oh, I'm sorry, Yuval Noah Harari. This is my mistake. Professor Yuval Noah Harari has a PhD in history from the University of Oxford, so a very prestigious degree, and he lectures at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specializing in world history. He also lectures at the World Economic Forum of Klaus Schwab, which is proposing the Great Reset. So this is how we transition from everything we've been saying, and you're saying there's been an apostasy. What Harari is saying in front of all these people who want the world to reset from its traditional economy, its traditional way of being in different nations, they want a global world. He is saying Homo Deus. Let's see. He's written Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind in 2014, and he looked deeply into our past. He's a very intelligent man. Homo Deus is the next book, A Brief History of Tomorrow, and this has become quite famous. Homo Deus means man God. And precisely as you were saying, there are intellectuals who think we can just focus on what we are as human beings and our hopes and our desires without any divine contact, inspiration, or law or instruction, and that we're moving rapidly to gather the data with our increasingly powerful computers to prepare algorithms which will guide our behavior and also integrate it with a type of artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
And that's not all written here, but that's what's contained implicitly in what he writes, but not just him, what many people are working on very hard. A kind of post human world, post God and post human, where we will not be as we were before, turning toward God as the highest principle, but really turning towards ourselves. What do you think about that, Eben?
Well, we know from the 20th century that we tried to create utopia here on Earth through communism, and it really failed. All these Marxist ideas about creating heaven on earth. Man has always had that dream that we could sort of be completely independent from God, and we could create our own paradise here on earth. and it has always ended up in a huge tragedy where a lot of people got killed and tortured. So I'm not sure it's going to succeed this time as well. I think it's going to be like total slavery, and it's going to be terrible, um, because we would lose our freedom
All right.
uh, as the
This,
human beings we are created to be. But since I'm a believer, I do believe that it will come to a point where God would say stop. That's my personal belief. That in the end, and also scriptures talks about Christ's second coming, and I think as Christians we need to have confidence in God will intervene before it gets too cruel and too inhuman, because this is really inhuman in a way. So it's hard to see because a lot of people are right now discussing artificial intelligence, and even those big brains who has been developing artificial intelligence, they are quite concerned now and very afraid that this is going to get out of control. Um, so I think there is good reasons to be concerned about this new technology, that it
yeah.
could destroy mankind as we know it today.
Yeah. So what I take from what you've just said, and we've come to the point where I describe you truly as a freedom fighter, because you are saying this path that we seem to be on is perhaps and likely to lead us into a new slavery. So
Mhm.
you're fighting against it the best way you can with your writing and with your talks as today. Therefore, there is something that we can do. You were saying we expect and we wait for God to intervene, but isn't there something that we can do as we still are alive and in this world, and we have to work out our own salvation? Don't you think we have to do something?
Yeah, but there's many ways God can intervene. He can also intervene through mankind. It depends on how many people are open to him.
Mm,
Really depends again on the single individual trying to understand our responsibility to cooperate with God. The way I see Catholicism is that we cooperate with God. Um, and grace fulfills nature, as Thomas Aquinas says, or completes nature. So it's all a matter of cooperation between man and God. And I think, of course, if we are open to God, we can change our world. But what I'm saying is that this is also a spiritual war.
mm,
So concerned that many Christians are still sort of using kind of worldly, you know, philosophies or politics to try to change this kind of development, and I think that's wrong. Too few Christians has understood that this is spiritual warfare, and is actually a war against evil. Because we still do believe that if we just get a new political prime minister, or we get a new political leader, everything is going to be fine. I mean, that's not the case anymore, because we're up against principalities and dominions which are very, very, very strong.
mm.
I think this is also a test of mankind, because God is allowed to test us. This is a test, because maybe we want our own destruction, and God can, and God, maybe He would even. I don't. Of course, God wants everybody to be saved, but He has also given us free will. So it's a matter of what we decide to do with our free will,
Yeah.
whether we want to cooperate with God. And I think if everybody start to live a more prayerful life and do sacrifices and have more faith, of course, good will increase in the world. But right now, it seems that evil has the upper hand, because too many good people are too weak or too silent.
Well, that's a very dramatic statement and a call to each of us really to assess, are we doing enough, even in those areas that are quite within our control. It's not like it's completely out of our control to say a prayer or to make a sacrifice or to have an act of charity or love that can slowly build in our society a kind of a fortress or something that can last through this terrific crisis that we're passing through. And the crisis reminds me, and therefore we put on the screen, of the ancient world. There's really two worlds, the ancient world and the modern world, and one world in between the two, which is called the middle world, the Middle Ages, the medieval world. The medieval world came into being after the collapse of the ancient world. And now it seems that this medieval world ended and became the modern world, and the modern world tried to look back to the ancient world and have a renaissance. That's what we call the Renaissance, the rebirth of the ancient world, and tried to return to reason and to go beyond Christ, really. And we've reached almost the limit of that now in the early 21st century, also with our technological. And Augustine watched the end of the ancient world. He was living from 354 to 430, right around the year 400. And he's writing this book. 410, Rome was sacked and burned, and by Alaric the Goth. And in 413 to 426, he wrote his City of God. And the City of God deals with the City of God and the City of Man deals with the two cities side by side in the same world, developing, living together until the end of time. And at the bottom, it says, the city of the elect, the city of God, and that of the damned, the city of man, are symbolic embodiments of the two spiritual powers, faith and unfaith, or faith and unbelief, that have contended with each other since the fall of the angels. They are inextricably intermingled on this earth and will remain so until time's end. So we're at a certain inflection point in this process, but it's really not unique or unprecedented. And in fact, Augustine is telling us that it's present at all times. How do you respond to that?
Well, there's something we should also remind ourselves in the modern world, and that is that this world is not our final goal, because we're extremely occupied with politics and the climate and this world. But if you look at the first Christians, I just spent two months in Rome, and
Yes?
what really came to me while I was there, especially when I visited San Clemente, which is one of the oldest churches in Rome, is that how much the first Christians were focused on the afterlife and the resurrection of Christ, that he has, brought us eternal life after this life. And this was their final destination. That was why they did not hesitate to become martyrs, because they really truly believed that they had a crown to win, and that was eternal life. We sort of, even today's Christians, we have lost that perspective. We are only concerned about this world, and we need to fix this world, and this world needs to be better, and so forth. I think perhaps it would be good for us to say, okay, this world will never be perfect because it is a fallen world. We have a fallen nature. As long as we are here, we are sinners, and we cannot make the perfect society. Instead, we should, of course, work on our salvation. We should make the world the best place we are able to make it. But that's not our final goal. And this is the hope of all Christians, is that even though we have this slavery because of big tech, I mean, this cannot take away our final goal, which is, to be totally united with God forever. No matter what kind of regime we have here on earth, that will be very evil and try to destroy everything we know, and even try to destroy our lives. Well, it cannot take away our relationship with Christ in our souls, and that we have, a final destination, which is heaven. And Christians today seem to have forgotten that. And I think it's very important to remind ourselves of what Christ says. What does it, I don't, I only know it exactly in Danish, but he talks about you should not be afraid of him who can only kill the body, but him who
Right.
can kill both body and soul. So even though what kind of ruler we have here on earth, he can never destroy our souls if we are together with Christ in our souls. And that this is what matters to a Christian. Maybe not to a pagan or to a secular person, but to a Christian, this is what matters. And I was really thinking about when I was in Rome, these first Christians, this was their focus, not how to make a better world or social justice. Or of course you want to help people here on earth, you want to be a good neighbor, you want to do what Christ told us to do, but this is not the final goal.
Mm. Well, those are again moving words, and you remind me of Pope Benedict himself. Your thought, your expression, your concentration on the soul was the concentration that Pope Benedict preached. He was the leader of the Catholic Church, the successor of Peter. I knew him. I had a number of conversations with him before he became Pope and met him occasionally. And he has just before he resigned the papacy, he gave a talk where he talked about faith and this world. And I thought it was appropriate to bring in some of these words here, which echo this tremendous fact that you just reiterated in your beautiful words, that the soul and the salvation of the soul is the important thing for Christians. And he writes, today, together with so many signs of goodness and a certain spiritual desert is also developing around us. At times we get sort of feeling from certain aspects we have news of every day that the world is moving towards the building of a more brotherly and peaceful community. But the very idea of progress and well-being have shadows too. This is his sentence here, the second paragraph. Despite the greatness of scientific discoveries and technological triumphs, human beings today do not seem to have become truly any freer or more human. So many forms of exploitation, manipulation, violence, abuse, and injustice endure. A certain kind of culture, that's our culture, our secular culture, the culture that is materialistic and doesn't think of the spiritual or the soul, has taught people to move solely within the horizon of things, of the feasible, to believe only in what they can see and touch with their own hands. Yet the number of those who feel bewildered is growing and search to go beyond a merely horizontal view of reality. They are prepared to believe in everything and nothing. So what he's saying there is that despite the many scientific achievements, there's something missing in the spiritual life of people, and they are feeling that lack. There's many evils that are still in our society, some of them growing, some of the types of abuse, and they are, as they cast around, as he says in this last paragraph, they are bewildered, and they want to go beyond this merely horizontal view of reality, this very sort of secular view without any transcendent dimension. They are prepared to believe in everything and nothing. That's the depiction of our society you just described, that we have belief in nothing. We're first society that is almost officially atheist. What do you think?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I think we have seen communist regimes that were also atheistic, but they have been crumbling down, like Russia and China. China is still communist, but you still have a growing number of people converting to Christianity in China. And you've seen how the Orthodox Church has been revived, enormously after the fall of communism in the Soviet Union, or the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think there is always hope, and of course, the Western world is not the entire world. You see, Christianity is growing despite persecutions in other parts of the world, in the Muslim part of the world, in Africa, other places. So maybe we're just like the Roman Empire, we're going to fall apart, but God would just, create new centers of faith on in other places in the world. I don't know. Maybe it's just because that we have chosen to reject God, but other people, there are other Christians around the world who has not. So the Western world is not the entire world, but it seems that wherever Christians are willing to give some sacrifices and to endure persecution, the church is growing. It has, throughout the entire history of the church, this has been a fact. Whenever the church was persecuted and the faith was strong and people were willing to do sacrifices, small sacrifices, big sacrifices, whatever, the church is growing. So it seems that this is the pattern. And right now in the Western world, I think many of Christians in the welfare societies has become a little bit too spoiled. We are used to having a really nice life and just being able to be Christians without any kind of, big problems. Now the situation is changing, and to make Christianity grow in the Western world, it probably requires some kind of sacrifice. And the big question is whether Christians in the West are willing to do that. I think that's a crucial question to ask. Are we willing to do just small sacrifices? Because, charity today towards people who are confused, are in a more confusion, and who are anxious, depressed, stressed, they need witnesses of truth and love, like Pope Benedict would have said. And this could be, of course, something that would require some kind of sacrifice from us to be that kind of witness in our own circle, wherever we live in this Western world. But we all know what we can do, and we all know our limits. But small sacrifices can even have a big impact on other people. So I think this is the best we can help and act out in charity, because this, of course, was always what attracted people to Christianity, was the level of charity. And today, charity is truth and love, because this is what you don't find in our secular world. It's truth and love.
Iben, you're speaking beautifully, and I have a reader or a listener, Kathy Loff. Thank you, Robert, for this podcast with Iben. She is wonderful.
Oh, thank you, Kathy. That was really nice of you.
So, you're also well known for your writing about some of the great issues facing Europe today. And we don't have time today, but I think we can do a second podcast on some of these questions. You touched on them when you spoke of the decline of the Soviet Union, which tried to create a perfect society. It was officially atheist. And then on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev signed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So the Europe, which had spent 50 years divided officially into East and West Europe, there was an Iron Curtain. That period came to an end. Now we're engaged in a war in Ukraine, and we're engaged in this globalist effort to create a sort of purely human, purely secular society. And you've got a lot to say on these questions, and I think you've traveled in the East. Would that be something you'd like to discuss?
Absolutely. One of my favorite topics, to talk about what I have experienced and the way I see it. And if I should, end on a note of hope, I would say that we have to look to the East, because when I was growing up here in Scandinavia in the Cold War, we were very afraid of Russia, of course, because we were afraid of an invasion. And if somebody had told me that one day I would travel to Russia, it would be open, I could travel freely, and I would stand on the Red Square looking at icons above the gates into Kremlin and see people going to church, I would have believed it was completely impossible. Like, it would never happen in my imagination. I thought people would be crazy saying things like that. But it happened in my lifetime. So maybe this atheistic culture we have here in Europe could come crumbling down in some unexpected ways we could not even imagine today, because this is what happened with the Soviet Union. So You never know. I mean, what's going to happen, and miracles still do happen. So let's hope.
Well, thank you so much, Eben. I think we'll be ending this conversation and we'll have another one, I hope, next week. Does that seem possible to you?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I'll be happy to join again, of course.
All right. Then we will talk again, and we really appreciate the profound insights that you've given us and the personal experience you've described of faith in a country where it's become difficult to be a Christian believer. Thank you so much for this time. It was a
Thank you so much for having me.
great
It was
pleasure to talk with you.
thank you.